Welcome to Disney Journey. I'm retired Imagineer Jim Schull. If you're a longtime viewer of this channel, you already knew that. But if you're a first timer, welcome. I invite you to subscribe, hit the bell notification button, and support my channel by becoming a member. I'll leave a link in the show notes below. The Pixar movie franchise Cars has been back in the news recently because the Disney company has announced further details for the new Cars Miniland to be going into Frontierland. Now, that'll be happening fairly soon. We don't have an opening date for it, but when it does open, it will not be the first Cars ride or land, not even the second. No, because the honor of the very first Cars ride that I was creative director for occurred not even in the United States, but in Paris, France, specifically Mandeville at Disneyland Paris Resort.
But before we talk about France, I've got to spend a minute to talk about how amazing it was that this former parking lot was transformed so convincingly into the environment found in the original Cars movie. Well done, Imagineers.
The Cars ride for Paris was not a big deal. It was not even the anchor tenant. It was not the showcased attraction. That would belong to Crush's Coaster. But Cars was important because it was a new, franchise for the company. It was successful as a movie, but no one knew how successful it would be. Once Cars, the movie, premiered, it started to generate a lot of cash for the Walt Disney Company. I mean, after all, every boy wants a car, but now they wanted the Pixar cars.
And that applied to French boys as well, because they wanted their cars. And so Cars started to creep into the Disney Studios park in Paris. First, that park needed something. And second, there really was no clean place to put them in the first gate, Disneyland Paris Park. And so very quickly, the work began. How do you bring Cars into this park? The park that needed it. And so it was going to shortly join Aladdin and Crush's Coaster there in Paris. Euro Disneyland had had success, but they also had a lot of needs.
As creative director for Toon Studios, I had an idea that by combining the Aladdin ride that opened with the park with Crush's Coaster and a Cars ride along with a character greeting area, that would provide critical mass in the area of the park that frankly didn't have very much. It also ticked off a lot of boxes because the Cars ride was going to be off the shelf, family friendly, relatively cheap, and it could occupy a very small amount of land.
The reason I was ticking all of these boxes is because you can't have just a good idea. You got to go and convince other people it's a good idea. But moreover, that the money available will pay for it. The schedulers, the estimators, the ride designers, the show set people, the lighting people, the sound people, the ride engineers, the ride vendor. My list goes on and on and on. You got to get them all in line. And you have to have them all nodding their heads, yes, we can do this. Now, it turned out it worked. And soon, Toon Studios was announced to become the major addition to the Disney Studios park there in France. For the first time, there would be a dedicated ride area that was family friendly. It wasn't very big, but it was closer to what Euro Disneyland had, and that's a good thing. The anchor tenant was going to be Crush's Coaster, as I said before. But Crush's Coaster had an issue, which was a height requirement. And so whatever the second ride was going to be, it had to have no height requirement in order to make everyone happy.
The Cars ride was not going to be an invention because we couldn't afford it. But it also was not an unknown to the Disney company because in Tokyo and in Anaheim, a version of this ride had already appeared because it was a classic version of a ride that was standard since the 1920s, sometimes called the Cuddle-Up. But this would be the first time Zamperla would be approached to build one of these. And it just so happens, after I did my research, I found they had a version of this ride. Now, it went by the name Demolition Derby, which is close enough to CARS that people started to pick up the phone in Glendale and make the call to Vincenza, Italy to make inquiries.
Returning to the topic of building the business case, the fact that I could be in a room and point to other installations of this ride system in other parks, well, it lowered everyone's temperature. One of the first ones was here at Mermaid Lagoon in Tokyo Disney Sea, because behind the walls of Triton's Castle, deep under the sea, was the whirlpool. It was a single installation, only a few cars, and it didn't need to be more because it was complementing other rides there. But it was very successful, had a good lighting package. It did what it was supposed to do, and it was a lot of fun. And it was a good thing to point to when I was trying to get people on board.
The inquiries led to a couple of discoveries. One of which was, even though Zamperla made this ride, they were going to be asked to build it to Disney standards. And unfortunately, the ride alone did not have great capacity. So I said, well, let's build two.
Of course, it's not as simple as just saying, let's build two. You got to pay for two. But the reason I like two, and I wanted to set them at odd angles to each other, is the single installations, like Ladybug Boogie here at DCA, they were good rides. But when you put two of the same ride system at odd angles to each other, you get near misses, and that creates excitement. Adding the second ride system at an odd angle made it exciting, not just to ride, but to look at as well. And so, well, I think I beat them down because we got not one system purchased, but a second system purchased. And it made all the difference in the world. So the Disney company cut a check for two, and as a result, CARS Rallye had no height limit. It had a big capacity, and it was a family thrill. And as I said before, it sat on a very small piece of real estate. But being small doesn't mean you can skimp out. No one had ever built this world before, and so I crammed as much into it as I possibly could. Radiator Springs was represented, not at the grand level it would be in DCA, but it was there, and I took a lot of pride in it. I equally took pride in lowering the ride platform 3 feet, or 1 meter, and the reason for that is that Disney Studios Paris was a flat park. There was no elevation change. There was no water feature. There were very few trees, and I set out to correct all of those in the design for CARS. Designing is like making pasta. There are a lot of noodles on the plate, topped with tasty sauces and maybe a little cheese, a little oregano, parsley, fresh chopped is always good. Making myself hungry. The CARS ride from Zamperla was pretty bare bones. And to take that mechanism, bring it to Disney standards, and then to apply the characters from the CARS movie was no easy task. So I adjourned to my drawing table. Now back then, I still drew. I mostly did digital, but I did draw. Old school. Today, it's all digital. Very occasionally do I pick up a pen. Anyway, back to the pasta. When you lay it all out in strings, you see what is a project schedule. And, well, you have to do the work. So I found myself in a plane with the team, and we went to Vincenza, Italy, home of Zamperla. And I would land, I'd drive, I'd head for the supermarket because I did like their toothpaste. Because they had a brand of toothpaste you can't get here in California.
When Imagineering called Vincenza, they started the conversation with Zamperla to inquire, how do we make this new ride, which is based on your old catalog ride, how do we bring that to Disney standards? And can we buy two of them? Because singly, there's not great capacity there. Can we make it quieter? Can we take a ride that is really a kiddie ride and make it large enough for a family of four to sit in? What do we need to do? Now, every time you start one of these projects, you always, well, you kind of lie to yourself, thinking, oh, this will be easy. There'll be no problems with this one. We'll learn from our mistakes. And then deep into the briar patch, you realize, ooh, I should have asked a lot of questions. Now, I'd done this before. This wasn't my first rodeo. And so as a result, even though there were a lot of learning curves, it was, well, it was manageable. And that's music to the ears of all the project managers. It's not that this project's without risk, but that the risk is going to be manageable.
Part of the risk management meant that very shortly I'd find myself once again standing on the factory floor of Zamperla there in Vicenza, Italy. I had already worked with Zamperla on several projects for Disney, and so I was familiar, and a lot of work was done very quickly. They're a great outfit, and I spent a lot of time with Antonio Zamperla, who sadly has passed. But he told me he really loved Disney and he loved working for the company. I'd sit with Antonio there in his conference room drinking strong Italian coffee. But soon I'd have to leave because contracts had been drawn, money's exchanged, and so I left. I left Vincenza. I also left the subcontractors because they were going to be doing the foam full-size first article of the vehicle. I flew back to California, convinced all would be well. But that Monday, when I got to the office, there was a phone call. And suddenly I heard them say, "Good news, we fixed all your mistakes." And so I got back on the plane as soon as I could, heading back to Italy to unfix what had been fixed.
After a serious dialogue began between Imagineering and Zamperla, they sent me technical documents, boxes of them. But I could use those to start to draw. And so I turned to my tablet and started to do iteration upon iteration of what this car would look like. Because whatever happened, it had to look like it belonged in that movie. You just didn't see it before. But the reality intervened, because the reality was Zamperla had built an off-the-shelf ride vehicle for children. And I needed a ride vehicle that would have an adult in the front with a child and ditto on the back. The other thing I faced was consensual versus non-consensual touching. And before you turn me in on that, what that really means is when people ride a ride vehicle that spins, they are having a great time. Their arms go up, their arms go out. And the tolerance between two vehicles is so tight, I had to design fins into the back of the vehicle to keep people from reaching out. Now, they might accidentally touch, but they're really going to have to make an effort to do so. And that was acceptable to the park operators.
Another design consideration was what people were going to be wearing. Because in Mondeville, people would wear heavy coats, big coats, in the winter months, and it had to fit in the ride vehicle. There were no lockers. Whatever you were wearing or carrying, be it rucksack or coat, it had to get on board with you. Another note was these taillights. I wanted them to look like they were vertical, but they were on a compound curve that had to be fixed. Also, the lights themselves had to be unscrewable because if they broke, which they would, they had to be replaceable. All of these little details play into the overall design. Soon, construction began because we were going to have to build this thing. And so the construction hat came out of the closet. It got worn, spent a lot of time at the field, did the character green area along with Crush and Cars. And the whole thing really came out well. The Butte came out really well, smaller than the one in Anaheim, of course, but you get the drift. All of the components of the movie are represented. It's fun. And it's populated by the Cars characters, like Guido and Luigi. When the ride opened, they were out in the open, but very quickly there were some traffic cones and barriers, and today they were fenced. It keeps them safe, but not out of the snow.
I follow as a designer the school of thought that suggests you can go off Broadway with greater success than if you stay on Broadway. And by that, I mean, if I'm building a new ride based on a franchise that is successful but not yet a hit, not yet a blockbuster, I can do that more easily in Paris than I could in, let's say, Anaheim or Florida. But the reality is, CARS was successful, very much so. And although it didn't lead directly to Mater, it did show to everyone that that ride system, if properly upsized, well, it could be something even greater. And so even though Mater was an invention and it led to it being in other parks for the last count, I can't claim that CARS in France is a brother or a cousin, but it's probably a second cousin once removed.
No matter what the family tree reveals, the reality is that CARS did lead to Maters and Woody's and the ride there in Florida and another ride over in Tokyo Disneyland. And we wouldn't have had those without this CARS ride. It was a chance, and it was off Broadway, and it was limited investment, but it was high reward because people really liked it, and people like cars. And today you can go to France and there's the CARS road trip, which is popular, repurposing the old tram tour, which wasn't that popular, but that's another story for another show. The point is, you have to take risks to get to rewards, and you try to manage your risk as much as possible. But sometimes you get lucky. And the Disney Studios Park Paris needed some luck, which they got, and a measure of success, courtesy of a fleet of cute little cars.
My little car has reached the end of its journey, so I'll park it here for now. But I'll be back in it next week for another new episode of Disney Journey. Meanwhile, well, just like these fine folks, please consider supporting this channel by subscribing, by becoming a member. Because by becoming a member, you show your support. You keep this thing going. I have a lot of stories to tell, and I'm just having too much fun to stop. Until the next time, it's goodbye from Lost Canyon.